Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Adult Chair on rashpixel.fm. I'm Pete Wright, and I'd like to say I'm thrilled, but mostly I feel like this is going to be a podcast of shame for me, Michelle Chalfant.
I know, Pete. Me too.
I don't know how we got ourselves into this bind, but we are talking about food today, and more specifically, the role that sugar plays in our food addictions and negative relationships with what we eat. And we have a guest to help us out, and I hope she will be gentle with us. Before we get started, make sure you head over to theadultchair.com to learn more about this show. You can subscribe for free by signing up for our mailing list, or find us anywhere the finer podcasts are served with a quick search for The Adult Chair. You can join the conversation in the Adult Chair private Facebook group or follow us on Twitter. We would love to hear from you. We also have the Spring Intensive. That's still open, right? We're still looking for folks to join us.
Yes. It's not Mother's Day weekend. I want to tell everybody the weekend before. I've had some people say to me, "Oh yes, it's Mother's Day weekend, so I can't come." It's the first weekend in May in Nashville, Saturday and Sunday till 4. Come join us. Learn the Adult Chair.
And where is it?
It is at the Scarrett Bennett Center, right? Actually, our guest knows it's on the Vanderbilt campus. Mm-hmm.
Outstanding. Vanderbilt campus. It's a beautiful location. Definitely really find out. You can register for the thing right there on the website and get more information there as well. So Spring Intensive with Michelle, Scarrett Bennett Center, first weekend in May. Okay. Karlys Randolph Pitman is a teacher and the woman behind Growing HumanKindNess, where she works with those looking for a new way of relating to food, body, and sugar struggles. She's the author of Overcoming Sugar Addiction, How I Kicked My Sugar Habit and Created a Joyful Sugar-Free Life, and offers a number of courses, including Overcoming Sugar Addiction, the 30-Day Lift, and her signature course, When Food is Your Mother, which I hope she'll tell us about later. Karlys, welcome to the Adult Chair.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm really, really delighted to be here. And I promise to be gentle.
It really feels, it really feels like somehow we landed ourselves in a position where you're going to be talking directly at me. I know I'm not alone, but I'm in good company.
Yeah. Everyone that is listening is going to feel like, oh my God, she's talking to me.
Right. Yeah. Can we just start real quick, Karlys? Can you give us just a brief background, how you got into the specificity of your work with folks relating to sugar and food struggles?
Sure. Yeah. In my own life, I had 20 years of eating disorders and I got really stuck. And it was not for lack of consciousness about it, in terms of it was pretty clear to me within the first year or so that I had a problem. It started for me when I was in high school, and I knew within 6 months this is much bigger than I am, and I knew it was out of control. At the time, I was bulimic and I was binge eating, and it started pretty innocuously, like for a lot of teenage kiddos, I imagine, where it was a feeling of, I just need to lose a few pounds, which was really tied to my own sense of who I was and at that time, and wanting to feel loved and wanting to feel more accepted. And that was what I thought was the ticket to achieve that. And it quickly morphed into, yes, I lost 10 pounds and I had a full-blown eating disorder. And that eating disorder definitely had control of me. And then we were talking, I went to school at Vanderbilt. You're talking about your retreat that's coming up. And Vanderbilt was a pretty challenging place to be, particularly if you've got an eating disorder. And it really expanded in college, and I really struggled. It wasn't for lack of trying. I was aware that I had a problem. I tried to get help. And it was almost like this became this seeking of trying to understand how and why I got so stuck, particularly when I was actively trying to do something different. And after I graduated from Vanderbilt, I actually became a mama pretty young, in my 20s, and I had 4 children. And what was interesting during that time was, as I was learning about becoming a parent and as I was learning about children and child development, something clicked for me. And I was reading parenting books. And as I was reading these books, I realized, oh my goodness, this is what I need. I could see parallels and what they were talking about in terms of healthy development of a child and my own development and where I got stuck with food. And so what's interesting about my personal experience, and I kind of joke that I did everything in the eating disorder umbrella. It would just move from one to the other. So it would move from bulimia, and then it would move to binge eating. And there were times where it wasn't quite so active. And then it would go to compulsive overeating. And then it would go to orthorexia, which is where I was just fixated on having to have a perfect diet. And I would read literally hundreds of nutrition books, every nutrition book I could get my hands on, trying to understand what was going on with me physiologically. And it was this quest of, well, if I can just find the quote right diet, and if I can just find the right way to eat and do it perfectly, I can kick this. I can stop binging. I can stop overeating. And in my case, I definitely had a sugar addiction where I was binging and compulsively overeating on just massive and massive amounts of sugar. And of course, there was a body component for me where I felt just a lot of disgust and shame about my physical self. So it would just swirl around all these different, ways that it would manifest up on the surface. But I came to really understand the roots themselves were pretty similar. And for me, what really helped me connect the dots was learning about parenting and realizing, similar, I imagine, to the work that you do, Michelle, is, wow, this is really about how I relate to myself and how I relate to my needs and my sense of my own being as a person. And so it was interesting that during the time, the things that really helped me the most and where I went to kind of get my training was I wasn't reading so many books and materials on the overeating itself. It was that developmental component. So it was a quest for my own stuckness and my own trying to understand myself. I had chronic depression and anxiety during this time, and a lot of confusion about myself and what it means to live as a sensitive being in the world, and definitely some real spiritual. It was a spiritual journey for me as well. So it became in my journey of trying to understand my own self and trying to support my own healing process. I became a student. I became a student of human development and developmental psychology, as well as spirituality as well, to try to understand. And then as I got further along in my journey, it became something that I started writing about and something that I started sharing and making sense of with others.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about your experience, Karly, because it is, I think when we talk about eating disorders, right, it tends to fall into a bucket of one thing, right? Oh, it's anorexia, it's bulimia. But what you're describing here, I think really represents an awareness of the incredible complexity that comes with our emotional relationship with food and the patterns that we create with food. And is that something you see with the folks that you work with? That the bucket of behaviors around food is much more complex than maybe we've stereotypically defined in the past?
Yeah, I find it complex and simple at the same time. And what I mean by that is those symptoms can take all kinds of different manifestations up on the surface. So with one person, it might show up as, it shows up as a real strong drive to eat clean, for example, and a real obsession with eating clean and what that means. And for someone else, it might show up as a drive towards exercise and really shaping and molding the body. And for someone else, it might show up as binging or over consuming. For someone else, it might show up as restricting. So it can show, I tell people that it can look kind of exotic on the surface in lots of these different ways, but it's kind of like children's behavior. Children's behavior can show all kinds of exotic symptoms. But what I came to see, if I could define the common root just in a simple way, is it was really about disconnection and connection. And what happens when we feel disconnected. When we feel disconnected from ourselves and when we feel disconnected from life. and what we do in the face of that separation. So I talk about with people about how a binge is a cry for help. It's actually what we could call an attachment cry. So in our human relationships, what happens is often what drives children's, quote, misbehavior is a need for connection. It just comes out sideways. It comes out as, they're picking on their brother, or that it comes out as aggression, or it comes out as a lot of alarm and anxiety and compulsive kind of behaviors. Or, it comes out as bossiness or dominance. In the same way with food, when there's that thirst and hunger for connection, it comes out in all these different ways. It comes out as the pursuit of food. It comes out as the pursuit of the perfect body. It comes out as control. But underneath all those, there is that sense of that thirst and hunger for connection. And so similarly to what Dr. Gabor Mate teaches in his work, where he talks about how, all addictions, what they share in common is that they're physiological substitutes for what we're meant to have in human relationship. So when we talk about, what for example, the neurotransmitters or the chemicals in the brain that get triggered when we eat certain foods. And there's a lot of attention in the media right now about sugar, for example, now. If we focus just too narrowly on the transmitters themselves, we're losing that big picture and we're losing that understanding, because that's what either the substance or the behavior is doing, is it's triggering all those things in our physiology and our emotions and our psychology of what we're meant to find in what we call attachment or human relationship. And so I've joined the chorus of others who are saying the answer to addiction, the answer to eating disorders, I would say, they're saying, is not sobriety, it's connection. It's connection. So what I teach in my work is not so much a focus on, quote, cutting out or fixating on the behavior itself, but really what you're doing is you're answering that cry for connection with connection. And as that deep need for connection is met, in my experience, a lot of the alarm and anxiety that's driving these behaviors, that can unwind and soften. The compulsions can soften. And so it's more that you are outgrowing that reliance or that need that you have on food, and you're replacing it. And what you're replacing with is connection with yourself, and connection with others, and connection with life or source, whatever that is, for people. So it's an outgrowing, and it's an honoring and a recognizing of that behavior as actually rooted in something very, very vulnerable and something tender and something basic to our very humanity. And in my experience, what that does is it softens so much of the shame around even having those cravings or those desires in the first place. I say cravings are actually prayers in disguise. They're saying, please see me, please love me, please care for me, please hear me, please attune to me. It's just an expression of need.
That is fascinating. That is, that's a totally new way to think about it. I've never thought about it this way. But Michelle, doesn't it get right back to what we were talking about just last week with breaking patterns?
Yeah, I'm paralleling this, of course, into the adult chair model, and it seems like it fits beautifully. Which is, it's the adult chair is all about learning how to reconnect with yourself, learning how to love yourself, learning how to live authentically. And what I would say, if we want to put it in the chairs, is that the compulsion would come from, the mind saying, if you eat this, then you won't feel. Then you won't feel I'm not lovable. You won't feel your shame. But what you're saying is, which I completely agree with, is when we drop into that inner child part and start feeling, what are my emotions in here? What are my needs? What are my true needs? And that's being vulnerable. Suddenly, the craving or the vice, the wine, the food, whatever we're doing to cover that up, it's not necessary.
Exactly.
So what are some steps that people could take, like with your model or with your way of food addiction and compulsion or sugar cravings, like what are some things that you can give to our listeners that would be helpful for them to get started even today if they're hearing you today?
Well, one thing that I think is really important is with this understanding is it is a process. As I imagine with the adult chair, it's a process because it's a relationship. Relationships takes time and they're built step by step. And so when you're teaching more of a relationship-oriented process, often what people need along with that is, well, what do I do in the meantime? Because it's going to take time for that to unwind. It takes time to build that relationship. And one of the key components that I teach in my work is the grieving process. That grieving process really unhooks and unsticks a lot of that compulsive driven energy, because in some ways we're still trying to make something work that doesn't work. There has to be this futility, this sense of no matter how much food I eat or how much I restrict or how much I go after the perfect diet, it doesn't work. It doesn't actually, there's no satiation. It doesn't actually bring me the peace or the rest or the love that I imagine it to. So that's one of the ultimate things. So people can lean into that and start to feel that. So I actually encourage people to feel their cravings more, not less. And I encourage them as well to feel what they feel afterwards. Because the training that I have is understanding this really is not a cognitive process. It's also really has to sink in on the emotional brain. That's where the adaptation really occurs. Particularly because we're really talking about a lot of our needs as deep attachment needs that need to bond. And that's what an addiction is. It's an emotional bond with something that is temporarily meeting that need for connection. So I encourage people is notice whatever it is that you find yourself when you feel that craving. And for some people, it's not food. For some people, when they start to feel disconnected, it's like, oh, I wonder what's on Facebook, or it's, it's notice, just practice noticing when you feel disconnected and when you feel frightened, when you feel nervous, when you're trying something new and you're venturing forth. All those things aren't wrong. We all move in and out of states of connection and disconnection because we're human beings. But it's like pause and watch. Well, where does it go for you? Without any shame or judgment, but just a real compassionate curiosity of, how interesting. For some people, it's they notice that they work, or it's an overgiving. It can show up 10,000 ways because that's just the way it shows up for human beings. So notice, I'm feeling disconnected. I'm feeling disconnected, and this is where I'm going to feel more confident or more safe or more secure or more at rest. And then notice afterwards, well, how do you feel after that? Because that's where it can start to sink in of, well, temporarily the food feels good. It feels good for, in my experience, about 3 minutes. And to honor that, again, it's not about judging that, but then really feeling at that sense of, oh, that doesn't really give me what I need. And then concretely practice reaching out for actual connection. So if your tendency is to go towards some kind of substance or some kind of pattern, just try one thing differently. So see what it feels like when you're feeling scared to try something new and you reach out to somebody, and it can be just an emotional connection of saying, hey, this is hard for me. It just helps me to connect, to know you're there for me. It doesn't have to be something, quote, monumental or big. But you're moving kind of in a different pattern. Now, with that, what I'll say is, those things, they take time. It's an unwinding process because there's a grieving process and there's a building up a relationship process. So in the meantime, what I tell people to do is to scaffold. And what I mean by that is there are going to be times when you feel overwhelmed, when just everything goes wrong in your day, when your child gets sick on the day you have an important business meeting, whatever it is, right? We all come into those moments, and we can all in those moments use substances or things as a way to self-soothe. So what I tell people is to plan for those moments. It's no different than when I go home for the holidays, I fully expect my children to have a meltdown. I plan for it. I don't make it wrong. And so then there's room for that within the healing container rather than it having to be outcast. And so what you do is then you plan for it, and you have a plan intact of where you just scaffold. It's like you build structures and rituals around it and say, okay, if in that moment I know my tendency is to go and eat a lot of sugar, what kind of self-care or support in that moment would help? And it may be that you call a friend. It may be that you go for a walk. It may be that you have a listening partner that you hop on the phone with. It may be that you go and you do 10 minutes of yoga. There's 10,000 ways to do it. But it's a shift in orientation rather than thinking I need to be on top of it all the time, to just making room of I'm going to have moments where I feel like I need some more support, or where I feel that sugar calling my name. And that, in my experience, softens so much of the shame, because it's not about behavior and not about being perfect. It's just recognizing, oops, I'm feeling disconnected. I'm feeling overwhelmed. How can I move in to give myself self-care and support?
When you say it this way, it sounds like this should be kind of easy, right? I mean, you're sort of retraining yourself. I think about my own mother, right? She's been living for decades now with celiac disease, very, very serious celiac disease. And she put it this way. She said, when I see something that, that other people think is delicious, if I see a chocolate cake, which she used to love, she has because of the reaction, the physiological reaction she has to it, she is retrained that is poison, right? That has become poison. That's the kind of replacement that I feel like I'm getting at. And what you've illuminated for me, and I find this really interesting, I didn't realize that I was having trouble with my own relationship with food and eating until I stopped working in an office with other people. Right.
Oh, so it's interesting.
Right. I literally left physical connection with other people, and it's the food that began to replace that. And I never made that connection before this conversation.
Wow.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's making me kind of rethink my, work at coffee shop days, or, find somebody else's house and just go sit in their house for a while while they're working,
or have lunch or something.
Yeah, we're wired for connection, and there's so many people who are doing some really brilliant writing and teaching that really illuminate this. And that's where a lot of where I went to study is really understanding how, as a culture, I kind of think of sugar addiction and the rise in eating disorders actually as a real red flag of how we're trying to live as a culture. And there's some beautiful teachers on this. I think of the way that Francis Weller, who's a grief teacher, the way he talks about it is he says, when our primary satisfactions are unmet, and those are, relationship, contact, closeness, connection, we pursue what he calls secondary satisfactions. So we pursue status, we pursue wealth, money, beauty, things, food. That's one. So I see that over and over in our culture. And also this idea that when we have in a culture that's really focused on achievement and individualism, like our Western culture, and that can really run at odds with a culture that's really rooted in human relationship and connection and attachment. So I think it's helpful too for people to look at the bigger picture of how are these things red flags of how do we create communities and a culture that really honors our human needs for culture and connection. Because what I find is people tend to blame themselves, and they think, oh, there's something wrong with me. And they can go to a real shame place when, no, there's nothing wrong with you. And there's nothing wrong with you. There's just unmet needs.
You started before we started talking on the show, you mentioned something about talking about this relationship with food and women. I wonder if you could talk just briefly about the issues that come up for that are split on gender, if there are any. What are things that women look out for in particular? What are things that men are on the lookout in particular?
Sure. That's so interesting. And I'll be really honest with you, Pete, about 98% 8% of the people I work with are women. So I personally don't have a lot of experience with men. I've started to get more experience with men in my classes. And I've always been curious why that is. That just because women in particular are more attracted to my approach, which is entirely possible.
Or men are too busy actually eating.
Or does it go to other places for men? What I can share is the experience of that I have had with men and women in my classes. For men, there's often an additional layer of shame. And I'm curious why that is. And my hunch from what they've shared with me is there is a sense that as a man, that there's a sense of I shouldn't be struggling with this. I think probably because there is, so it tends to show up a lot more with women. There might be some shame there, as well as they've talked to me about how it's, again, the culture of how we define masculinity and how we define men and how we define men's relationship to their emotions. I have 2 boys and 2 girls, and it's so interesting to me to parent both. And I see how in my boys, you can see that cultural pressure, and all my children are very sensitive, how it's just not encouraged to feel as a boy and as a man. And so I can only imagine, and I can imagine that extra layer can create challenges. You talk about, Michelle, in your model, where to relate to yourself, you have to be able to feel. You have to be able to have your feelings. You have to be aware of them. You have to feel them. Right. And if we have a culture that doesn't even honor feeling in men, we can see the challenge for them and the greater shame that can arise.
It also seems to me that men, and I could be completely off here, I don't know, but it seems like, a man might come home and have wine or a beer or some sort of alcohol, and that's how they're numbing out over food. And I'm not saying that men do not numb out with food, but it seems to me, because I know certainly a lot of men that are unconscious eaters, just like women are, but it just seems to me in my realm that women gravitate more toward food. And alcohol, of course, but men seem to grab some sort of alcohol before they would go toward food.
Yeah.
Not, again, I'm generalizing here, but
I think I can see that pattern as well. I'm thinking about just the people that I know, or, what I see in our greater culture. I just wrapped up a class. The primary class I teach is a class called When Food Is Your Mother. And I called it that class because they called it that title rather, because that's what I saw. Is as I've listened to people's stories over the years, that's what I heard and that's what I observed, is that the food was like a mother. It was like a lover. It was like a best friend. It was where they were going to feel that sense of safety and security, as well as that sense of being attuned to and being listened to. And people in my classes have shared such poignant and vulnerable and tender stories about the ways food has been that mother for them, that mothering, nurturing presence, what we imagine a mother gives us. And in particular, what they point to is how the food is an unconditionally accepting, loving, inviting presence, where they feel free to feel. And in particular, where they feel emotionally attuned, where they feel like their feelings and their experiences are really validated and seen. So that's one area where I see for women in particular, where the food bond is really, really strong. There's that sense of really wanting that validation for their inner world and for their inner experience. And the food would give that to them. The food in some ways would be that understanding presence that they weren't getting in their relationships around them.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you both bring up, and when I think about again, I'm the men in my life that have struggled in their marriages. When they struggle with food, it's when they struggle with their spouses. right? It's when their wives are somehow departing from them in some way, shape, or form that's when they start having struggles with food. So, the salience of this, when food is your mother, it's that maternal relationship, the maternal part of the marriage that is by definition a part of the marriage, is when that is absent, there is something that will fill that gap, and that is generally cupcakes.
Yeah.
Wait, maybe I'm speaking too personally.
No, it tends to be the fatty, sweet. It tends to be fatty, sweet foods that bring
something
up
that's going to kick off the dopamine.
Yeah, that brings that sense of that closeness, that soothing, that being held. And I want to be really clear, because I think something that really changed for me in my journey was, food was such a struggle for me for so long that at one point I really went to this place where it's like, well, food should just be fuel. It should just be fuel. And I have to say, I don't agree with that now. I see it a little bit differently. And the reason why is I think any intact food culture in the world understands that food is one of the primary ways that we do bond and connect as human beings. And I really started to look at that and see, is that disorder? Is that, quote, wrong? In the same ways that, we bond over celebrations and birthdays, and we bond over rituals and milestones, and, we can bond over sports teams and there's all kinds of ways we bond. In other words, it really changed for me where I looked at that innate human longing to bond. And what if that wasn't looked at as disorder, but rather, again, as some natural part of our human wiring? And so I actually encourage people that there's a positive way that you can use food to create connection. Have a huge potluck and invite friends over. The word companion means with bread. And if you go to a lot of traditional cultures, or cultures that have a great food culture like Italy, they still have this idea where food is a way to gather around, and that in many countries you would never go to someone's house. The first thing that people would do to offer hospitality is to offer them food and drink, because it's a primary way we care for each other. So I honestly think part of what needs to be healed in our culture is to find a real positive food culture and to create that positive sense of well-being where we are not eating alone or eating over our phones, but we're actually connecting and gathering around a table where you have nourishing food paired with human relationship and connection and vulnerability. What a powerful experience for a human being. And in my experience, having those kinds of positive, nurturing experiences, they can really offset that sense of needing to get it in secret or on the sly, or that it becomes there's room for that. And that's something I even recommend for families. I'm often asked, well, how do you prevent food compulsions in children or eating disorders? And for that, I would say, again, my same answer is connection, emotional connection, but also giving your child lots of positive food experiences where you're creating positive connections between a sense of being fed on all levels, and not seeing that being fed on the physical as somehow bad or wrong, that really seeing that as a beautiful part of being human.
For me, when I think about connection, it's more than having a meal and talking. It's taking it to this other level that we are uncomfortable with. There's that vulnerability. I think about myself. I grew up, and we spent every summer on this lake. I'm from Rochester, New York, Italian family, grew up, all these people around me, lived with grandmas and an uncle and my parents and sister. I had a lot of people around me, a lot of people talking to me. But you know what? I have a very early memory of probably being 6 or 7 years old and looking at a pizza. My grandmother would get pizzas. Remember the Schwann's man? They'd come up with a big van. And anyway, she'd get those Schwann's pizzas. And I remember saying, can I have a pizza? And she would make a whole pizza. And I remember, I can see myself right now, probably 6 years old, thinking, if I eat that whole thing, it's going to make me feel so much better. And it's interesting because I had all these people around me talking to me, but there was a lot of dysfunction. There was a lot of emotional abuse, mental, all these things going on. But yet we all talked, but there was this level of connection that was missing. I was codependent with my mom. My mom was not capable or able. She was very young. She was 21 when she had me, so was not able to set boundaries, and there's just a lot of enmeshment happening. Anyway, so I learned at a very young age, food is helpful and food will numb me out. And I used to, and to this day, I have to be very mindful around pizza. But in college, there was some anorexia that was happening. So I definitely had some issues with food, and I had a lot of friends. So when I'm hearing connection, in my opinion, and this is where I want your opinion, it's more than just having people around. It's having people around that will really listen, that will validate, that will ask, how do you feel? And really take care of us emotionally, set boundaries for us, and validate just who we are as human beings and care enough to ask.
Absolutely. And I use the word connection as a shorthand for attachment. That's what I mean. Is it's really a sense of, do you know me? Do you see me? Because the deepest level of attachment is to be seen and known, where you feel like you have an invitation to be who you are, and you feel like that who you are is seen and known by others and shared. So absolutely, yes. In fact, you can be around people all the time. It's not just. And that's where attachment people equate it with baby bonding, or reduce it to a real simple thing where the deepest levels of attachment aren't about sameness. They aren't about having to be the same as someone. They're not about having to always be physically with someone. That you could have, for example, a deep relationship with someone who's no longer even living, because relationship can transcend death. Yes. So it's really, for me, it's the shorthand of, it's often that deeper level of connection that we want. And as you describe, it can be very confusing and very painful when we're surrounded by people and it can feel so empty.
You took the words out of my mouth, like so empty and so lonely. And I'm like, how? And that's how I spent so much of my life, feeling empty, lonely, and sad. And I couldn't understand why. And until I learned about attachment, that's when I finally realized, I'm like, oh my God, there's the missing piece. There were attachment issues in my childhood. And that's why no matter who was around me, it's still, and again, food, that was my best friend. I mean, pizzas, I was not a sugar, but again, it's a simple sugar of the pizza. But when I had pizza, any sort of carb, like pizza or potatoes or popcorn or something, that was my thing. And man, that would make me feel really good. I didn't care about cookies. I wanted pizza. But I remember, I still have a vivid memory, 6 years old, eating that pizza and going, I'm going to eat the whole thing. So you need to make another one if you want some for yourself. And I'm thinking, I'm like 6. I'm looking at myself now, like I think I was 6 or 7. Like, oh my God, it started that young for me. But bringing mindfulness in, like you were saying, again, I would call it consciousness or mindfulness in. And that's the only time we're in that is when we're in this healthy adult, which most of us don't know. That changes the game. It's all of a sudden, it kind of wakes us up out of that dream of, hold on, I'm in the middle of eating this. I didn't even know. Like I've had many occurrences where I'm in the pantry, not even aware of what I'm eating. And then I go, hold on, where am I? What am I doing? And it's like I wake up, so
yeah. I call that with people in my classes. We kind of talk about like your inner dog whisperer, like your inner Caesar Milan, where he holds that space of that calm, connected, secure presence of I'm here. And we can have a whole conversation about that, because there is how you relate and how you come alongside those parts of you that feel really vulnerable and that really, really still long for and want for the food, and how you care for all the different parts and different selves and come alongside. But you're taking up a relationship with all those things inside of you. You have a relationship with your cravings, a relationship with your needs. And that's why, again, I see cravings as they're not the enemy. They're actually doorways into a relationship with yourself.
I love this. You're turning, your idea is to turn inward, which I love. And instead what we do is we judge ourselves like, oh, I can't believe I ate that. Instead of getting curious about why did I eat that? I wonder what that's about, and inviting that in and dropping inside of ourselves. We want to judge it. So I love this. This was great, Karly. Thank you.
I feel like we could go on and on, but we can't because you have to go. And I want to give you just a minute to tell us about what you're working on and where people can find out more about your great classes.
Yes. If you'd like to learn more, it's www.growinghumankindness.com. And I teach When Food is Your Mother in the spring and in the fall. So the next time I'll be teaching it is in September of this year. And so if you're curious and wanting to learn more, I've also got lots of free courses on my website and some home study options. So growinghumankindness.com is where you can find all those resources on the blog and all kinds of ways to learn more, to even understand what does it mean, connection? What does it mean? How do I support myself? How do I have a relationship with that vulnerability and those needs? And what do I do in the meantime? You can find a lot more resources there. So I'd love to have you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karly. You're a terrific resource, and we'll absolutely have you back to have this second conversation.
Oh, I'd love to have that one too.
You read my mind. I'm like, we are so having her back.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great. And you were super gentle with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Kid
thanks
gloves.
for having me.
Right.
No shame. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody, for downloading and listening to this show. And don't forget, if you're an iTunes user, we'd sure appreciate it if you head over to iTunes and drop us a kind review. For the podcast reviews help others find the show and learn about the great work of Karly Randolph Pitman. On behalf of Karly and Michelle Chalfant, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll catch you next time right here in the Adult Chair.